Rugby as we know it today is a game that is not often thought about in North America. Ironically, it's a sport that originates out of rugby that we no longer call rugby that has grabbed the continent's attention. And on the other hand, while association football or soccer is often called the world's game, for good reason, it is not the only game that has won hearts and minds in multiple corners of the globe. Out of team sports, I sometimes like to think of our planet as having 4 world games: football, cricket, baseball, and rugby, with basketball sort of on the outer edges, on the verge of entering world game status. But speaking of rugby, if you ask someone from the Americas, East Asia, or the Middle East about rugby, it will likely be recognized as a fringe sport, only recently gaining its feet in some of these regions. However, rugby is an absolute cultural and commercial force in the UK, Southern Africa, and Oceania. And while this may not seem like a huge range of places for it to be popular, remember that rugby has since inspired other forms of the game that owe their existence to it, such as gridiron football, Aussie rules football, and Gaelic football, all cultural obsessions in their own right in North America, Australia, and Ireland respectively. Furthermore, when I speak of rugby, rugby purists might want to remind us that there are 2 dominant codes of modern rugby, each with some differing rule sets and in-game dynamics. However, for the sake of this video, I'll be speaking of the 2 codes, Rugby Union and Rugby League, interchangeably. Because not only does it make this discussion easier, the 2 codes have enough in common that I feel like they can reasonably be part of the same conversation on the development and culture of the sport. If you disagree with this, feel free to get your pitchforks out in the comments, if there are any comments, probably not. Just know that I don't really care.
Oh, so forming an angry mob, eh? Who we going after?
So for the very sports-minded such as myself, when you think of rugby, usually the first place that pops into your head is New Zealand, followed by Australia, where the sport has become the most commercially viable and a primary sport in the national consciousness of those nations. The more observant of us will also recognize the surprisingly deep presence of Pacific Islanders in the codes of rugby, within popular rugby leagues such as the NRL of Australia or Super Rugby of New Zealand and others. There are Pacific Islander players all over these leagues, such as Maori men from New Zealand itself, Australian Aborigines, Samoans, Tongans, French Polynesians, Fijians, Papua New Guineans, even the 2 nations that dominate the conversation in international rugby in both codes. New Zealand and Australia have Maori, Pacific Islander, and Aborigine DNA within their squads, so the achievements of those 2 nations on the world stage are just as much the achievements of the native people of Oceania as it is for the white Kiwis and Aussies. During international competitions, a lot of Polynesian, Micronesian, and Pacific Island nations will perform decently relative to their small geographical size and low populations. So why did this weird British sport become a national obsession on nearly the opposite corner of the globe from where it originated in the United Kingdom? For white Oceanian people, that might be a little easier to explain. Rugby was a British export, and Australia and New Zealand have spent the majority of their modern history as British possessions. The linguistic, cultural, and religious links with the British homeland were very strong, so it made sense that white settlers took to the sport. However, you might come to wonder why of the various British-originated sports, such as association football or cricket, why rugby won out among British settlers. Now, don't consider my answer to be gospel or even 100% accurate, but I want to make an educated guess as to why the sport found just the perfect place and time to take off in Oceania. This goes back to the native peoples of the region. In New Zealand, for example, the Maori have a well-documented martial culture that puts a high premium on physical strength, bravery, and warrior mentality. This is similar in many Pacific Island cultures, so the basic premise of rugby really vibed well with the local culture when introduced. Here's a sport that is warlike in its nature, needing strength and courage to be played well as determination and cunning. When the sport took off in the mid to late 1800s, as many rugby federations and leagues were born around the world, it came at the peak of European colonialism. This era was essentially a dick measuring contest of who had the strongest military and who could conquer the most land. Therefore, even among European settlers, showing strength, courage, and martial prowess was a point of pride for many of the people at the time. Therefore, it all seemed to coalesce in the two codes of rugby becoming absolute national obsessions for both natives and white settlers as they both tried to show their bravery and courage off to the other. It was just the right place and just the right time for rugby to take off. The next question is, as colonialism and racism only got uglier in the ensuing decades, would the British colonial authorities tolerate Pacific Islanders within their sport, or would they try and gatekeep it for themselves? South African rugby, despite its popularity, was haunted by apartheid thinking and segregation until the 1990s. How did Oceania fare? New Zealand has a tradition of Maori athletes going back to the late 1800s. I cannot find any evidence of Maoris being purposefully segregated as a matter of policy, and it is said that some of the very first All Blacks squads had included Maori players. This is not to forget the Maori All Blacks teams that toured the world showing off their skill as well. I want to clarify that this doesn't mean racism in the sport didn't exist. It definitely did. I'm just trying to look at this from a legal perspective. Another thing to note is that there had actually been a lot of tensions between the New Zealand and South African rugby unions about South Africa's apartheid and segregation, as Maori players would at times be excluded from visits to South Africa because of their race. Australia doesn't seem to have had any policies of official segregation against Aborigines and Torres Strait Islander people in their rugby league history, although there have been a ton of racist incidents. Interestingly, I did read that Fiji had segregation in their rugby until 1945. Once again though, just because New Zealand and Australia didn't pursue official segregation in rugby, such as what America did in sports like baseball, that doesn't mean there weren't barriers and massive challenges for players of color. Staying on this topic, I think it is important to mention the race relations in rugby's most influential nation, New Zealand, and how it affected the perception of the game of rugby to the rest of the region. While New Zealand definitely does not get a free pass for its British colonialism and settler favoritism throughout its history, as well as for the many acts of racism, both institutional and individual, committed by New Zealanders, it should be noted that even during the most repugnant times of imperialist racism, New Zealand tended to be ahead of the curve when it came to relations with natives. Historically, it always seemed that New Zealand was not as extreme as other countries during the era of European colonialism, and seemed to have had the best native rights of any of the former English-speaking British colonies, such as the USA, Canada, Australia, and South Africa. Of course, basic human rights and decency should not be a special commodity anywhere, and should be the bare minimum in a modern nation, but those were the times people lived in. It was a terrible time to not be white. But yeah, I think New Zealand's relative progressivism, as well as the lack of official sports segregation in the rugby strongholds of New Zealand and Australia, allowed rugby to flourish in Oceania, as it became an attractive pastime. Both whites and natives loved it, and at least legally there were not barriers to joining the big leagues. So with the cultural basis of the sport established and its commercial viability entrenched, this made way for the next factor that has aided Oceanian rugby to stay as a dominant force, despite quite the push from other sports, such as soccer and basketball, to become popular there. Alongside the cultural appreciation of the sport, another thing that has aided its longevity is the financial attractiveness of being a professional. The majority of Oceania is a developing place, only recently gaining independence and finding their feet and identity after centuries of displacement, racism, and conflict. Oceania is a recovering region. Sometimes the options in our capitalist-centric world are not plentiful, but for young Pacific Islander men and in more recent times Pacific Islander women, there is an allure to training in rugby and making it big in Australia or New Zealand, and potentially becoming a star. The population of native Pacific Islander people is fairly low relative to the world population, so being as big of a sports fan as I am, seeing such high visibility for these people in rugby, Aussie rules football, and the sports adjacent industry of pro wrestling has really opened up an avenue for me to learn more about this incredibly overlooked region on the earth. Its fascinating cultures, its strong-willed people, and its myriad of stories just waiting to be told. I only started paying attention to rugby during the COVID pandemic, as during some of the darkest times of that era, rugby and Aussie rules football were some of the first sports to continue in the absence of many sports at the time, in summer 2020. But I have become quite fascinated with its culture, not just in Oceania, but in other strongholds of the sport such as the UK and South Africa. And I even have my eye on the nascent rugby scene in North America as well. I hope this little look into the interesting history of this sport and its peculiar rise to prominence in Oceania has been as interesting for you to hear about as it was for me to research and compile. Thank you for watching.